Well, hello and welcome to Zwift Coaching Podcast episode 20. Matt Rowe here with Greg Henderson. How you doing, Greg?
Hey mate, how are you? Nice to be back.
Top man. And of course, Kev Poulton. How you doing, Kev?
Yeah, good, thanks, Matt. And how you going, Greg?
Yeah, good mate. Good to be back.
It's good stuff. All right, and today our topic is about going fast, sprinting. I think we've touched upon so many aspects of sprinting in previous podcasts, but never talked purely about the topic, which is maybe a little bit surprising given the knowledge we've got amongst us. But yeah, today is all about sprinting. So to kick off, and this is a really open-ended question for you guys, what makes a good sprinter?
Greg, there's got to be you going first for this one. Come on.
Yeah, I'm just, but that's just, yeah, that's like you said, it's really open-ended.
Just describe yourself, Greg.
When I look in the mirror, every time I get up in the morning and excrete excellence, it's definitely, but then there's open, like, are we talking about a track sprinter? Are we talking about a road sprinter? Are we talking... So I mean, obviously it's got to be a certain amount of fast twitch fibers and power. You've got to have that power. And then, of course, you've got to have that little bit of mongrel inside you where you're going to push that gap, or find a gap. So there's, there's so many attributes to a sprinter that makes a good one.
Yeah, I was going to touch on personality first before we start talking science and muscle fibers and so on. There's always that throwaway comment, typical sprinter, and there's a stereotype of the sprinter that they have a personality that what's the polite way to put it here? Obviously very hard working, but yeah, they take a lot of risk and they're very, very keen to win and win at all costs as well in some ways. So yeah, typical sprinter.
Yeah, I think that mental side of thing, that's kind of almost quite tier number one. And coming back to types of sprinters. So Greg, you said where am I going with this question? Yeah, taking track sprinters and looking at Keirin racing. So a video popped up on YouTube the other day that was recommended, and it was Keirin racing. And I watched that and I thought, holy moly, these guys and girls, just different breed. I mean, put me in that position, I'm gonna naturally my brain is gonna tell me, "Oh, back off! This ain't safe. Don't be doing this." So I think the mentality side of things is number one. Have you seen you've never done the Keirin racing? I guess, Greg, never had a go at that for Bants.
Not at massive World Cup level, but I've done like at T-Town. I've raced at Keirin. I raced against Marty Nothstein when he was in his prime, actually, and that was a funny story because I made it to the final somehow. I'm not sure how I made it to the final, and I thought, right, all I got to do is follow Marty, and I'll get second place. No worries. So I'm at the back, and he's at the back. I'm on his wheel, and I'm like, oh, perfect. No one's fighting for his wheel. I'll just follow him. He takes off down the back straight, and literally within 3 pedal strokes, he'd put 3 bike lengths into me. The power that they produce is just amazing. And he went forward past everyone and won, and I finished 6th. I didn't get past anyone.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you haven't heard of Keirin racing, just Google it. It's pretty good spectacle. Obviously, it's a track discipline, but pretty.
That was the one that Jens Fiedler won. You watched the one that Jens Fiedler won, and maybe the New Zealand boy got scrubbed.
Can't picture that. Was there a big crash by any chance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some good ones there. There's some good ones.
Yeah, carnage. So, obviously that's one end of...
Sorry, man, I was just going to say, touching on the mental side of things there, and you talk about crashing there, Greg, do sprinters lose their nerve after a major crash?
Personally speaking, for sure. There's definitely the next couple of times where you'll probably touch the brake every now and then more than you would. But it takes a while to get back in that flow, because I've had a couple of really big bingles where, you are pushing the envelope because, if you touch your brakes in a bunch sprint in a tour or something like that, you lose 10 places and you just can't get them back at that speed. So it's if you do crash and it's a painful one, there's no question. There's always that little doubt, and especially if you're still recovering from an injury. I mean, I think you'll remember some of the races that Greipel would enter, like Tour of Turkey, coming back from a broken shoulder from the Classics or something like that. He wouldn't even contest the sprints just because he knew he needed the racing, but there's still that chance in a bunch sprint that he could crash and re-injure that shoulder. So and he was, you could tell he was just a little nervous of his injury to carry it on forward. So it's it just depends on timing, how bad the crash was, but I definitely would say a little bit gun shy. I call it a little bit gun shy afterwards.
I think that's human nature, isn't it? I mean, anyone who can hit the ground at 60k an hour, bounce back up, and the next day get up and do exactly the same thing. Well, probably a bit superhuman. I'm sure there are people out there, but I guess human nature to have that. There are some slight reservations in there somewhere. So looking at road sprinting, obviously, which is where your experience mainly lies, Greg. Couple of K to go. Let's take the biggest races in the world, Tour de France. What is going through your mind? Even a couple of K out from the finish. I mean, you're purely What's going through your mind there, Greg?
So the stressful time is actually up to about that point because. Remember the GC riders, the time's not neutralised until 3 kilometres to go. So you're actually battling GC teams that are super strong at 55, 60 k's an hour until 3 k's to go. So there's not much room on the road. You'll see us actually spread across the road, and you'll look at the TV, from overhead or from the front, and you look at it and go, oh, they're just cruising along now because there's 8 teams across the road. But in actual fact, the guy on the front's probably doing 550, 600 watts to try and hold that position to make sure that either his GC rider or his sprinter is in good position and out of the wind. And then once 3K, you go through 3K, the GC teams start to drift back now because they know they're a bit safe. And then at 2K to go is basically where you actually have enough men in your lead out, a full lead out, like 6 guys, to make the 2 kilometre distance. You can't start any earlier than that because other than the guy to position you, hold you in position. But when the hammer goes down, it's actually the safest part of the sprint because you're going so fast that no one can actually pass you. And if they do pass you, it's not with a huge amount of speed. They're only going 1k an hour faster because you can only go so fast. Once the hammer drops, once the lead out starts, it's actually the safest part. I mean, okay, it's the fastest and it's the hardest and whatever, but it's actually the least stressful. And then you go through 1K, and you make sure you've got always protect one side of the road. There's always a wind. You always have to check which direction the wind's coming from. So you protect that side so that no one can come up the inside of you and get a protected run. Always make sure that my sprinter, Andre Greipel, is on the correct side of my wheel and out of the wind, even if that means I have to sit out just a little bit to protect him. It's so important that he gets to 200 metres without having touched the wind. And then I take off. I see the 500 metre sign. I take off. And again, I leave one corridor just down the barriers, just wide enough for Andre, because I know you've got to be really careful sprinting in the tours because everybody's screaming and yelling and their hands are over the barriers. They're slapping those placards together, making all that noise. So you've got to leave just enough room that one person can go down there, and then Greipel will always come down the inside on the sprint train at 200 metres to go, and then you can just drift a little bit to the right towards, and if anyone tries to follow Greipel down that corridor, you could just give them a sneaky wee squeeze, and it might hesitate just that 1 or 2 pedal strokes, and then that's Greipel gone. If you give him two bike lengths, you probably won't see him again. So that's kind of the rundown. That's kind of what goes through the brain. That's what I'm thinking the whole time when I used to enter those last couple of Ks in a bunch sprint. Good
stuff. I think from what you're saying there, you probably made a career out of being a lead-up man. So obviously the importance of having a lead-up train and leading each other out is it's obvious. And I think for amateur bike riders, this concept of leading each other out, teamwork, it's not just a pro thing. So yeah, for you amateurs listening, partner up with a teammate or a friend and lead each other out. Be a domestic, be a team leader, and I think take 10 races in a season. I would argue you're going to get better results in 5 of those events as a team leader with a dedicated lead out or positioning support versus 10 events solo. So not only are you going to get probably better results, you're going to be safer, you'll be out of trouble a lot better, and it'll be a less stressful ride and more enjoyable. Just something new, something different. And you get a chance at being the Andre Greipel, being the Mark Cavendish, and then you get a chance at being the Greg Henderson or the Renshaw, whoever it is, in that kind of support role. I think that's kind of highly rewarding.
And Greg, you gave a really good description there of what it takes to lead a good sprinter out at World Tour level. From a training perspective, training for lead outs is one of the hardest things to replicate in training at a training camp. Like, we've run so many drills over the years, and the guys always say it's just nothing like in the race. Like, you can't, like, it's hard to train for it with all those things that can go wrong during that last 5Ks, 2Ks to go and so on. So yeah, while we can replicate the power and so on, but in terms of replicating the stress and the danger and all the twists and turns and so on, it really is hard to put that in place in training. So yeah, it's something we actually struggled with over the years to put in place at training camps with the World Tour guys. But what we do these days now is at a training camp, we obviously have just the one team there, but we split them up into two groups, and we give each group a sprinter, a guy that they want to cross the line first, and we basically race them against each other over a distance of between 5 and 10 kilometres. And we found that the longer you make the lead out, the more realistic it is. So if you do lead out training over 1 kilometre, everyone's too fresh and going way above what they normally would, and the sprinter just can't kick at the end. So if you make those lead outs in training much longer, it's more realistic. Guys are hitting their normal power. And then rather than who wins the sprint, we then go back and look at which sprinter had the least amount of surges in their lead out. And that reflects on, obviously, the guys leading the sprinter out, because as you would know, Greg, as your role as a lead out, it's not just a matter of getting to the front, it's getting your sprinter to the front without really hurting their legs and saving all that power for the sprint at the end.
Yeah, 100%. That's exactly what I had to do when I went from, because I used to, when I raced for Sky, I was the sprinter there. Then I went across to Lotto and became the lead out for Andre. And it was exactly that. I could sprint, and it would load Andre up. He'd have to get out of the saddle, and he would load up with lactic acid, and then, I'd reach my terminal velocity. He'd sit down again and wait till I was finished, and then he would have to accelerate again. So that's massive loads of power, and accumulation of lactic acid before he sprints. So we actually had to change what I do. So I had to do the whole 300 meters out of the seat. So I was bigger profile for him, for more of a sit basically, and then flatten off my peak power. So by the end of my career, I was only hitting 1200 watts maximum in the sprint, but then I wouldn't fall below 1000 watts over the 20-25 second lead out. So it was just a really nice, smooth, fast power profile that didn't, and Greipel could absorb that in the seat, and then light it up for his sprint when in 200 to go. So it was definitely something you have to take care of.
Yeah, it's interesting that a good sprinter doesn't make a good lead out guy. I've had comments from Caleb Ewan that one of his lead out men was leading out like a sprinter, not like a lead out guy, and it was just too explosive and too surgy. But once they got that feedback, they were able to then change their lead out tactics and make things much more smoother, and obviously the results were better. So yeah, a good sprinter isn't always a good lead out guy.
Yeah, I think just jumping back to something you said a minute ago about kind of the race replication in training, practicing these lead outs. As junior on the GB squad, we used to do coach-led racing, it was called, and it's actually something we do locally now with groups of riders that we coach in South Wales. And you get a group of riders together, and we'll kind of give them all different roles. It may be a case of, right, you need to kind of buddy up with this other rider, and you need to, you're going to lead this rider out. You need to try and go for a long one, basically give everyone different roles, maybe 10 or 12 different riders, give them a role, and what you actually see played out is maybe kind of carnage to the untrained eye. We've actually got all these different plans being executed, and that kind of helps the normal regular guy who doesn't have 40 race days in a year, 40-50 race days in a year. They may only be getting 4 or 5 races in a year. It helps them then in training prepare for these big races. I think in order to become good at something, as Rob was saying, you need to practice it, and certainly need to kind of practice your sprinting in training. So just talking about pure sprint drills, guys. If you haven't got you haven't got a big lead out train, what have we got any training examples that our amateurs and riders at home could implement at home, maybe on Zwift or out on the road if they're on their own?
Just before we head into that, I was just going to touch on a little bit more of what you were saying, is how important it is to do this training in out there, because a good friend of mine, Danny Pate, he's a really good time trialist, and his actual words to me were just like, how often nowadays does anyone finish solo and win a bike race? It's quite often you come to the line with 6 or 7 other guys. So if you can't sprint, you're going to get 6th or 7th. And then he was just saying he must have done most of his career and then started doing some simple sprint training, only 2 or 3 times a week at the end of his ride. And he said his power increase was 200 or 300 watts. And I was like, mate, if I got 200 or 300 watts, I just couldn't get that in such a short time. But what you have to realize is if you're going from 800 watts to get to 1,000 watts, it's not a big improvement, and it's with that neuromuscular drive, isn't it? It's the climber or the time trialist learning the coordination of a sprint. So they're going to get massive increases straight away. So it's really, really, if you're not a sprinter, it's vitally important to do these sprint drills. It can be, like I said, it can just be sprint to a signpost at the end of your ride. But it's just so good for you when you come to a race scenario and you're in a break with 5 or 6 other guys that you're not the slowest, you don't have the worst power, and you'll gain power so quickly just by doing some simple sprint drills.
Love that. Have you heard of, or do you know what a splimer is?
A splimer?
A splimer, yeah. Do you know what that is?
Wouldn't be Simon Gearin's, would it?
Yeah, bingo, you got it. A sprint climber.
Yeah.
So yeah, Gavin, Michael Matthews, Sagan, maybe Sonny Colbrelli, that type of rider. And it's true, you know, even the climbers, you know, the climbers that can, or the guys that can get over climbs, that can sprint, boom, household names because they've got that sprint. Just kind of leading on from what you said there, Greg, about, you know, sprinting is not just for the sprinters. And if you want to win stuff, you know, sprinting's sprint training is important for everyone. So we spoke a lot about sprinting here, and what makes a good sprinter and different types of sprinters, and even touched upon the training for sprinters. But what about sessions? So kind of a session, or, you know, ways to train to become a better sprinter.
Okay, Matt. Well, there's a bit of a trade-off here. So to improve your sprint, you're actually going to decrease your VO2 and your threshold power as well. So good sprinters typically have what would be considered a low threshold power, and vice versa. If a time trialer wants to improve their VO2, they're going to decrease their sprint. So one does affect the other. So if we're trying to improve our sprint, there are a few key sessions that we can put in place, but I would first of all look at the sessions that are decreasing someone's sprint and eliminate those first. There's a bit of a misunderstanding that we can increase VO2 and sprint power as well, but it's quite hard to increase both to a large amount. So looking at the kind of sessions that actually have a negative effect on our sprint power, it's things like all that long, medium tempo, intensity type pace stuff. We call it sweet spot or tempo work, 20-30 minute efforts of that. That actually has a detrimental effect on our peak sprint power as well. Also, strength endurance efforts, they are good in a certain way, but again, if we're doing long 10-15 minute strength endurance efforts, it's going to have a negative impact on our sprint. So if you're looking to increase your sprint power and you're performing those kind of sessions in your training, I would first of all eliminate those and then look at putting in place some good sprint workouts to focus on peak power.
So just on those, the longer, the sweet spot, the strength endurance efforts, we're saying eliminate those if you want to be a kind of a pure top-end sprinter, but they would have a place earlier in a training program. So periodization, chunking up your 6 months. Even the sprinters, would they do strength endurance efforts and the sweet spot earlier on in their training program? Yeah,
good point. So we need to look at it this way. It takes between 6 and 8 weeks to really cause a change in our sprint power and see a positive gain there. So 6 to 8 weeks to increase our sprint. It takes 2 to 4 months to really see a big change in VO2 power. So one obviously takes a lot more work than the other. So our fast twitch fibers respond to training much faster than our slow twitch fibers. So you had a good point there, Matt. So early in the season, we're going to perform those longer efforts to build our endurance first. Once we have our full endurance capacity and we're coming into our peak race period, if you want to improve your sprint for that race, then allow yourself between 6 and 8 weeks to really build your sprint and have it ready for your peak race.
Okay. And in sprint training, there's obviously a difference between becoming a faster sprinter. I think a lot of people kind of come to me and say, right, Matt, I want to produce and kind of increase my peak power. And you ask them, like, why do you want? So basically, they're saying, I want to increase the power I can produce for a split second on training peaks, so they can say, right, I am now a better sprinter. So ask them, like, why do you want to increase that peak power? Oh, because I want to sprint faster. You have to look at a sprint, and of course, a sprint isn't what you can achieve for a split second. It's more 10, 15 odd seconds at the end of an event. So what's the difference? Or what would the difference in approach to training be if you wanted to become a better sprinter in the real world versus producing a higher crank torque for a split second just to register that big number on training peaks?
Well, it really is about spending time above lactate threshold, similar to FTP as we know it. So it is, as you said there, it's those short explosive efforts above lactate threshold, above FTP, very explosive, high crank torque. So in terms of some example sessions, big gear from a very slow, almost standing start, high crank torque, high power at the start, wind it up as fast as you can. It should take between 12 and 15 seconds to get that gear wound out, efforts like that. One of the main things too is also keeping fueled. So when we do our sprint work, we do burn a massive amount of carbohydrates. So to perform effective sprint training, we need to make sure that we're fueled up correctly as well. So on those days, have a high carbohydrate intake on those days as well. Another way is in the gym. If you do have access to a gym, obviously the high power in the gym and explosive movements. We're not looking for strength in the gym, we're looking for power. So we want to replicate the speed that you would move the cranks in the gym as well. So it could be through leg press, squats. So you're going a little bit lighter, but a faster explosive movement on the way back up. So going down slow, pause at the bottom, explosive back up. And another way is actually not a sprint session as such, but our endurance rides are long and very low intensity as well. So like I said before, avoiding that medium tempo intensity type effort. Endurance rides are very low intensity and go along if you have the time.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, a couple of things that we used to do was if you're sprinting in the real world for a bunch sprint, you've got to be very, very efficient at seated power because there's so many surges in the final, round a corner, round a roundabout. If you can stay seated and you've got loads of seated power to deliver and you don't have to get out of your seat every time to accelerate to close that little gap, and you can just go, really quick and really efficiently on the pedals and dance up to that wheel without getting out of the seat. It makes such a difference. You save so much energy until it's time to actually, launch your sprint. So that's one of the key points. The other one that I used to do was, I mentioned it just before, and it was the coordination of a sprint. And it sounds quite funny, but in actual fact, it's a real thing. Like if you actually have to try and get out of your seat and produce power at 120, 115, 120 RPM, there is a lot of coordination involved, like getting the muscles to actually fire in that firing pattern and getting them to fire quickly and powerfully out of the seat with the, obviously the bike going from side to side. It's not as easy. Well, it is easy. Everyone can do it, but it's about how efficient you can do it. So a simple thing I used to do was I would call it the free lead-outs or free speed. I would just roll down this downhill and it would get me up to 55k an hour or something like that, and then it would either flatten off or just a gradual pitch uphill. And so you take the free lead-out so you can get up to speed without, loading up with lactic acid, and then you just slam it for 10, 15 seconds, and at this high speed, at this high RPM, like you don't have to be in your 53.11. You can sprint in your 53.14 or something like that. Just getting that coordination and that efficiency to sprint well out of the seat. So it makes a big difference. So the seated power for the run up to the sprint, and then the efficiency out of the saddle.
Yeah, two real fantastic points there, Greg. I think the first point you mentioned about being in the saddle, you see it so often. You're in a line and you'll come out of a bend and there's like a 1 meter gap a rider's got in front of them, and they're at the saddle and sprinting flat out just to close that 1 meter gap. Whereas if they stayed low, stayed aero, nice and smooth, just kind of sucked into that wheel, as you said, a lot more efficient. I think a lot of that comes from the track. You see riders who've got a track background a lot more comfortable in the saddle at that high cadence, accelerate on the wheels in the saddle a lot better. So yeah, great point. And again, that coordination point, that's a top one as well.
And that's easy enough to train too. Like you just replicate it. You can accelerate out of a corner, just stay seated. When you do Kev was talking about, even when you start doing those standing starts and things like that, why not put a session in, 1 or 2 sessions in that are seated the whole way instead of out of the seat accelerating, because you actually do have to produce high crank torque as well. It's really, really important.
And I guess too, guys, in terms of frequency for sprint sessions, twice a week is normally enough, with good recovery in between. So you might have a sprint day on a Monday and the next one will be on the Thursday with full recovery in between. And just like recovery in between the sprint days, normally between the sprint efforts in that session, full recovery as well. So we're looking at between 7 and 12 minutes minimum between each sprint out on the road during a sprint session.
We just did this lab in exercise physiology with sprint training, and it was, you know how you touched on how many calories you actually burn in sprint training, and it was incredible the amount of calories that we were burning in this laboratory. And then they said, well, the trade-off is, and you think about it, and it's so true when I've done my sprint training or my track training, you end up so hungry, like you almost replace or over-replace the calories that you've burnt because you're so hungry from sprint training, and then you end up tired, so you don't do anything for the rest of the day because you're absolutely cooked from sprint training, and you go to bed and have a sleep. So you think you're doing such a great thing burning all these calories, and then you go home and eat and sleep. You just waste your time. So I guess if you're at the pro level, my take home would be I'd be a little bit careful of what you pile into your gob directly after your sprint training, because I can tell you I've probably been guilty of it myself a few times. You get home absolutely buckled and you just want to raid the fridge and empty the pantry.
Yeah, I think the other one is riders having confidence that when they're doing a sprint session, they're going out and they maybe only doing six efforts. That is a quality day's training. I think some riders will tell them, right, you're going to go out and you're going to do 6 flat out 100% efforts, and that is a good day's training. Riders think, no, I can't do that. I've got to kind of press on, and in that 7 or 8 minutes recovery, whatever it is, between sprints, so many times you see a rider's power drop off immediately after one sprint, but then they're back up to kind of riding in zone 3 in between the efforts. And I always say, you're either in these sessions, you're like a light switch. You're either on or off. You're either sprinting or you're recovering. And I think it's just trying to get riders to kind of rein it back, not press on too hard in the off section. This is where I think Zwift is fantastic in workout mode, where as a coach you can prescribe perhaps the free ride for the sprint section, and then in the off period, you're really limiting the power that the rider produces down to 40% of FTP or whatever it is to force that rest. I know, Greg, you gave us a session to do a little while ago on Zwift that was a really good sprint session. Perhaps our listeners can have a stab at that one.
Yeah, so exactly. I put one on there, and it was specifically for the training camp that we've got coming up, and it was basically I tried to simulate the lead out as much as possible. So it's a gradual increase in power, and then today you're actually on this sprint session, you're actually the sprinter. So the last 30 seconds is quite hard because that's when your lead out man goes, and then the last 10-15 seconds it says free ride, and free ride doesn't mean then stop pedaling, guys, the effort's done. It's free ride. It's 10-15 seconds flat stick, absolutely giving it everything. And I did the session tonight before I jumped on, and it's deceptively hard, and that's the thing. You've got perfect recovery, so you feel like you're doing nothing, but you have to absolutely 100% recover so you can give it everything on those 10 or 15 second sprints. And, it's surprising how cooked you are after just doing 4 of those efforts. It's so hard, those sprints. They're so violent, they're so maximal that you really can't do much more than that without compromising your power profiles.
And then also that session is kind of simulating a real life sprint where it's not just a 10-15 second effort. This is kind of that ramp to kind of replicate in the real world. How do we balance the training for those 2 types of sprints? So one sprint being, or one type of training where you're literally trying to nudge up that neuromuscular power, your absolute max on one side, and the other side you're kind of trying to produce a high power towards the end of a race after a lead out. Very different sensations. How do we approach those for the amateur out there?
Well, for those lead out efforts, we really want to look at repeating efforts just below a maximal effort of between 10 and 30 seconds with good recovery again. So we spoke about doing 6 intervals in a session. If you can do 6 to 8, say 20 to 30 second almost maximal efforts in a session, that's a good way to really prepare yourself for that longer kind of surging lead out profile that's needed in a race.
And I always say to riders, say you've got on the weekend, you've got a group ride with your friends and it's a couple of hours, let's say it's 2 hours, make the most of that opportunity. So maybe on the way to the ride, if you can do 3 sprints on the way to meet the ride, you're gonna do 3 sprints while you're fresh. You're gonna really hit that, your top end peak power. You're gonna produce some hopefully good numbers. Then just go with the ride, enjoy that 2-hour ride with your mates. And obviously your legs will be slightly fatigued because you've got those sprints already in your legs. And then at the end of the ride, perhaps when maybe there's a sprint for the sign at the end that you all do, or when you're riding home on your own, do another sprint. And in that one session then, you're going to hit, you're going to target 2 different types of sprints, one on fresh legs, one on tired legs, using kind of the infrastructure around you, so the group ride. So you haven't got to do anything drastically different. Stop going out with your mates or stop going out with the group. Use what you've got in place and just try and think outside the box. How can I use this ride or this chain gang or this if I've got an hour watt biking session in the middle of the day that I can link up to Zwift or whatever it is. Just use what you've got around you. Try and be smart, and you haven't got to kind of make loads of sacrifices.
I would also suggest that in training, have some variety in the length of your sprint. The difference between doing a 6-second sprint and an 8-second sprint, it's massive. The change of energy system and the way it feels afterwards, that last 2 seconds, you can really feel the change in what's being fired in your body there and what's being activated. So 6-second sprints, we can pretty much do those all day long with good recovery. Once you start going 8 seconds and 10 seconds in duration, it really does produce another level of fatigue, and they can't be produced multiple occasions throughout a ride. So really experiment with the length of your sprints and get some feedback on the sensations that you get back from there, and try and go a little bit longer and see how many you can do from there.
I was just going to agree with what you said, Matt, with using the environment, and that was kind of what I used to always do with my training. Even if it wasn't a scheduled sprint session, I would be like, for example, I lived in Girona for 10 years, and with some of the big long descents and the big long switchbacks, it would be, you would just freewheel and coast down. So you've got actually full recovery on these descents. So then I would come out of a hairpin corner and do a massive acceleration, 8 seconds acceleration. And then you've got full recovery again until you're fully recovered on this descent, because sometimes you may be descending for 20, 25 minutes, and you can always pop in four sprints on your descent. So again, it's one of those where you've done a free sprint session because you're coming in with a bit of speed, you accelerate out of the corner, you're not in the biggest gear possible, but you're touching all those power curves that you need. And like you said, you've used the environment you don't have to go into a specialised sprint session. You can do it with whoever you're riding with that day.
Yeah, I like that. Whether you're using hairpins as markers or lampposts or just like a road sign in the distance, all good stuff. A couple of minutes ago, Kev, you mentioned energy systems, and something we haven't really spoken too much about. Just want to go into what we mean by energy systems and the energy system that we use for short, sharp sprints and the other energy systems that we use for kind of longer couple of minute efforts.
Yeah, well, I mentioned before completing 6-second sprints, and that's predominantly from the creatine phosphate system, which replenishes very quickly, and that's why you can produce those multiple times in a training session. Once we start to go a little bit longer into that 8 to 10 seconds, we're now going into that lactic acid system, which we can normally hold for about 10 to 30 seconds, but again it takes a longer recovery there as well. So in terms of sprinting, we're looking at creatine phosphate in that first 4 to 6 seconds, and after that we're kicking into the lactic acid system, which lasts for about 30 seconds. So that's what I was saying, experiment in the length of your sprints and just get used to the sensations that you feel, and once you get to that 6-7 second mark, you really do feel a difference, and you fatigue quite quickly from there.
And I whenever I try and communicate with people about energy systems, I kind of distill it into simple terms in my mind and listen to this and tell me what you think. So I always think of your ATP PC system being kind of, so I basically, the currency of energy, I use alcohol. Okay, so your ATP PC system, let's call that a shot of vodka. Your lactate system, let's call it a glass of wine. And your aerobic system, maybe a stein, those big German steins of shandy. So where we're talking about, getting energy into your system via these different energy systems, we're talking about getting alcohol into your system by these different drinks. So if you think, for an 8-second sprint, you're using your vodka energy source, you're necking that shot of vodka, then your lactate system, you're drinking your wine, bit less alcohol in that wine, you drink it a bit slower, less energy goes into your system a bit slower, and then your big stein of shandy, really weak, a weak drink, not much alcohol in there. It's your aerobic energy source, which is very slow to release energy, but you've got plenty of it. That's like how I kind of think about it. So in sprinting, the first thing you're going to do when you stand on those pedals, when you're fresh, is just neck that shot of vodka.
Hey, Matt, has anyone ever said you might have a problem with alcohol, or has anyone sort of brought that up? Because I don't know if I'd be talking about drinking vodka while I'm sprinting. Some sprinters are mad enough already.
That was good, Matt, but I actually thought of it maybe in terms of coffee. So I would go espresso for the short sprint first, that 6-10 second one. Then I'd go cappuccino next for the 30-second sprint, and then the latte for the longer aerobic effort. So I think coffee, you think alcohol, but yeah, good luck with that.
I suppose we are cyclists. That cycling culture, coffee is probably more going to resonate a bit better. So, but yeah, either way, there's some drinks there you can think of energy systems in.
Hey, Kev, would you go that lactic system? Is that before you? I mean, it's all anaerobic because that's without oxygen. So where does the anaerobic system finish exactly?
Long conversation here. So we know that they're always working in unison, the three energy systems. Just one is the predominant energy system. So that lactic acid system is generally about 30-40 seconds. That's when it's at its maximum there. Then we really start to go aerobic after that.
Lovely. I think just before we wrap up this main topic, unless you've got anything else you guys want to add, just going to talk about kit and I guess the change in kit that these sprinters are using. The obvious one being helmets, the fact that their helmets are all covered in. Even down to wheels and socks, all the attention to detail, whether you call them marginal gains, bit of a cliche these days, but these sprinters are really doing everything they can to kind of eke out those tiny watt savings or speed gains. And that's all been fairly recent, I think, in the last kind of 5-6 years, maybe.
Mate, do you want to know who invented that?
Go on.
Yours freaking truly. I tell you the story. Okay, listen to this. This is going to blow your mind, mate. So, Paris-Nice, 2010. I just joined Sky, and I was, whatever. I was the sprinter for that year, and I said, well, I was talking to the sports scientists and everything, and they'd made me a filled-in helmet, because I always raced a filled-in helmet on the track. And I said, well, why don't we use a skin suit? Because a skin suit is so much faster. And they're like, oh, well, we'll see how you go. So for that first stage in Paris-Nice in 2010, I had because it was so cold, I had all my clothes over the top with a skin suit underneath with my numbers. And then when we got about 50 Ks to go, and I started stripping off and gave my clothes to, because it was clear we were going to have a bunch sprint, gave my clothes to one of my teammates, and I made the front group of 30 in this crosswind, and then won the bunch sprint and took the yellow jersey. And then someone came up to me the next day and go, "Were you wearing a skin suit yesterday?" And I was like, nah, I don't know what you're talking about. And so then the next time I used it was in Milan San Remo. And what I'd done there is I'd pinned my pockets with, so it made a pocket and I could put my food in there. And it was actually Fabian Cancellara came up to me and he goes, "Is that a skin suit?" And I went, "Yeah, it is." Because I was still a bit nervous of like breaking the mold, like I still felt a bit nervous. Like I just felt like a bit of a anyway. And he actually was the first one to say, "Wow, that's a really good idea." And so then at the Giro, I raced the Giro with Wigo that year, and the team had made us racing skin suits with pockets in the back, and we literally rode 21 days in this bloomin' road skin suit. So that's where it all started. It was like just
quality.
Yeah, it's something that we just tried,
That's
and then
cool.
it just caught on.
That's cool. And while you've been saying that, mate, I've just Googled Greg Henderson Paris 2010. It's come up. Yeah, today the riders connected 201.5k. The first stage, the victory was for Greg Henderson, and there you are in a skin suit. Cool, mate.
100%.
Cool.
Yeah. Because that was, and then if you talk to Cav about it, and he'll even says in a few of his interviews, it's like, even Kittel now who does this massive power, Greipel who does massive power. I mean, Cavendish's major advantage for all those years was his aerodynamics, how low he was to the ground. And, he's racing against these big sprinters. They're big, burly sprinters, and whereas Cav's got his nose on the front wheel. It's just aerodynamics. And then all of a sudden, these sprinters, they start lowering their frontal surface a little bit. Like we dropped Greipel's stem by 2 centimetres. We put his handlebars in by 2 centimetres. So Greipel rides 38 centimetre handlebars. Then, of course, he's got the aero helmets, the skin suit. So it just takes away at Cavendish's advantage that he had of aerodynamics. Then we get everyone has the fast wheels now. Everyone's got a sprint bike, like an aerodynamic bike. So just those little advantages that he had, it just the little percentage. I mean, he's still got a very small aerodynamic silhouette. He's still smaller than everyone else, but because they're aero in that position, Kittel now, you see he sprints with a flat back, so he's actually as aero as he can be for a big guy, and he's in a skin suit. So it's definitely a real deal. And I mean, Kev, you'll know this. I mean, especially at 70k an hour, 72 k's an hour, that's when massive changes in aerodynamics come in.
Yeah, it's huge, and like you said, like it really is all the talk now about aerodynamics rather than peak power. It really is. It's CDA now, that frontal surface area, and how much they're pushing into the wind with that. So, yeah, I guess we should probably touch on, power numbers just briefly. What guys are hitting there, and then it's interesting to then hear what the little guys are actually hitting to win a sprint. So we know, like you said, guys like Greipel and Kittel, they're hitting 1900, cracking 2000 watts peak power in a sprint. But the small guys like Cav and Caleb Ewan, they're hitting 1300 and winning a sprint over these big guys are hitting 1900. And it's just all through aerodynamics.
Absolutely.
For most guys, or riders, amateurs, probably the quickest way to become faster is probably not through physical training. It's probably technique. So if you go out and do a sprint, chances are when you stand up the saddle and you give it everything, your form is just going to disappear and in a puff of smoke. Your head will go up, your elbows will go out, and you're just going to be catching loads of wind. Again, come back to the point you made, Greg, about coordination. You can be completely out of sync. Your bike could be going left, your body to be going backwards, and you'll be all over the place. So I think, practice. Focus on your technique, and even get a mate to video you, because I think until you see it on video, you don't really have an appreciation for how much you let yourself go, how much you let your form go. So I'd encourage you to go out with a friend, video each other, doing a sprint. And then when you come back, maybe you're practicing, you're doing your sprinting on Zwift or whatever, have in the back of your mind your form, your technique, and that coordination will come over time. Cool. Okay. Well, I think that wraps up the main topic of today's podcast. We obviously got your session in there, Greg. So the Greg session to improve your sprinting will be attached to this podcast for you all to have a go. Cycling terminology. Greg, have you got a term there for Kev to have a stab at in 30 seconds? I'll be the timer.
Righto. Kev, you should be pretty familiar with this actually, because every time I've seen you ride your bike, you look like you're doing this, and it's called peddling squares. 30 seconds from now.
Yeah, you're right. That definitely is me. So it's when basically you feel very unfit. The fluidity in your pedal stroke, it's not there. It feels like every movement has a dead spot in the pedal stroke. You can't get comfortable. Very robotic in your movement. Just basically isn't smooth. You feel like you're not warmed up even though you're half an hour into your ride. It really is an inefficient pedal stroke. You're not going to go very far with it, and you can't really maintain it for long.
Time.
You just feel uncomfortable, basically.
Yeah, we all know it. We all know it. I guess this type of feeling you get after an off season, right? First couple of rides back, pedaling squares.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I've never even heard of that before. I haven't. It's foreign to me. I've got probably one of the most beautiful pedaling techniques on the planet, so I wouldn't even know what pedaling squares is like.
You're just a beautiful human being, Greg.
Just the epitome of bloody pure excellence, mate.
Brilliant. Okay, moving on to our quickfire question. Okay, and the question goes: a long day in the breakaway. Are you in the hooks or on the hoods?
Hooks.
I'm going hoods, and I'll just justify myself. I think it's purely for comfort. I think that aggressive position on the drops for me all day, it can get a little bit. I appreciate it's me more aerodynamic and quicker, but a little bit more uncomfortable. And I just seem to be super comfortable on the hoods.
I'm thinking energy expenditure. I want to try and save as many calories as I can, so I'm going to go aerodynamic for the whole way in the hook.
And with that aerodynamics, but I'd actually be you wouldn't find me at a long day breakaway actually. And if you did, I'd be stuck on the back saving more energy. I wouldn't be taking a turn, so I'd be down on the hooks, sitting on the back.
Fair enough. Good stuff. Okay, got 3 questions today from you listeners, so thank you for sending these in. Question 1 is from Eamon K that was sent in via email. And the question reads: split days. Should you do the intense session first or second in an ideal world?
Well, good question. And first of all, I'm glad that he's doing split sessions now, so that's very positive. I would say it depends. Depends on the time of the year and where you are with your training. So if it's early in the season, we want quality. So I'll be doing the intensity in the morning first, and then the endurance in the afternoon. And then coming into the race period, we want to produce the best power we can under fatigue. So I would do a morning endurance session and an afternoon intensity session coming into a race period. Yeah,
I 100% agree with that. I couldn't add anything more to that. That's exactly how I do it, and I do it with my athletes, and I think that's how all the top guys do it. Periodization, depending on what part of the season you're at, and whether you do them at the start or at the end of your training or your second session.
That's interesting. The rides I coach are all kind of working guys and girls, and I think mentally, having already trained once, albeit steadier, then taking on maybe a full day in work, it can then be tough at the end of the day to complete a really intense session, as well as you maybe would have done earlier in the day when fresh. So I always try and encourage, like, guys, get up, if you're going to do one session before work, one session after work, get the harder one done before work, so you can go to work, and if you come home from work tired, it's not so tough mentally to jump on and complete the second session of the day. But physically, I guess, the question was, to be fair, in an ideal world. So yeah, completely take your point. If you had all day to do these sessions and nothing other than lying on the sofa, chilling out, relaxing, recovering in the middle, I think you guys are bang on. But purely from a kind of a mental kind of motivational point of view, I always encourage riders to do the tougher session, probably the more intense session, in the morning.
I like that point you've made there, Matt, and that's true. Obviously, people that are working and other commitments, it's a bit harder that way. But I guess to add to that then, so if we're going to do our intensity session in the morning, I would start preparing the night before. So for dinner, make sure you're having carbs for dinner. And then if you do have time before you train in the morning, consume some more carbs. So you're training in a high carb state for your intensity session. And then perhaps during the day, while at work, go no carbs or very low carbs, and then do your afternoon endurance session in a low carb state to get the extra benefit from the training session. And then immediately after that afternoon endurance session, consume some carbs again to replenish for the next day. So if you are going to do double sessions, you can add another point of stress on the body by periodizing your carbohydrate intake as well, just to get that extra effect to it as well.
And that's the key to training, isn't it? As many stresses that you can add to the body is what because your body has to have a stress to adapt, and that's what training is. Training is stressing the body, and your body adapts, so then your body becomes stronger. So if you keep adding a stress to that, to any way you can at any level, then the body has to adapt, and you get these gains. So that's another really good point.
Yeah, and I guess just one other point there too, Matt. Like what Greg said then is exactly right. We're all about trying to put stress on the body to make it adapt and get stronger. And if you are pushed for time, if you don't have time to complete a 1 hour session, 2 half-hour sessions in a day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, another great way to add stress to the body as well. So it doesn't have to be a 1 hour session to make gains. If you can break up into 2 half-hour sessions in the day, you're still going to make some big progress doing it that way.
Absolutely. And for people, if you've got an hour for lunch, rather than grabbing a bite to eat and sit around yapping for your whole lunch break, get down the gym. If you've got a gym in the place of work, fantastic opportunity to train. Using your commute as well. So a split day could be done. Commute to work and commute from work, and tagging on some bit of a loop or maybe some efforts on one of those commutes is a real smart way in my mind to do a double day, a split day. And fitting it around your lifestyle and your work life commitments.
The fastest bunch ride in sunny Dunnos is the workers' lunchbox. They go out at lunchtime. They call it the lunchbox ride, and they're out for 40 minutes, and it's just they go out the door. It's flat stick for 40 minutes, and they're straight back to work. The lunchbox, mate. Come down and have a crack at the lunchbox. I bet you can't win it.
I bet I won't get round, mate.
Yeah, I know. They go too fast.
Cool. There you go. Split days, Eamon. Hope that helps. Question 2 is from Todd Murphy, and this question was sent in on the Zwift forums. And the question reads: how does watts per kilo compare with speed? And this is the real question here. Does Zwift take your weight into account when determining your speed? Otherwise, someone that's 70 kilos will be traveling much quicker than someone who's 100 kilos if they're both putting out the same watts per kilo.
So what he's touching on there is obviously the coefficient of drag that we just briefly talked about with sprinting aerodynamics. And, obviously someone who's 70 versus someone who's 100 kg aerodynamic silhouette, which is basically your frontal area, how much resistance you're going to have to push through the wind. 100 kg person is obviously a lot larger mass to move through the air. But in actual fact, if it's aerodynamic, that mass, if it's in a streamlined position, and we're going to take rolling resistance. Obviously, each bike on Zwift are going to be very, very similar to each other. I think there are some slight differences on Zwift with the Tron bike versus say the steel bike from Zwift. There are slight rolling resistance differences, but hardly, they're negligible. But the big difference is when watts per kilo with speed is when we start to go uphill on the road. On the flat, there is a difference. There's no question, but not a massive difference. It's not night and day. Whereas as soon as you hit an uphill, you will have night and day differences in watts per kilo and what's sustainable uphill.
Yeah, and what was that rule of thumb? I think you give us on a previous podcast. For every extra, slightly away from the question, but I think it's really, really interesting. For every extra kilo you're carrying, you need an extra, how many watts?
7 watts, extra 7 watts of every kilogram extra you weigh, roughly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Cool, but just to round off on this question, if you input into Zwift your height as being 6'4", like me, and you're 100 kilos, and I'm producing the same watts per kilo as one of you guys who's a bit shorter and lighter, producing the same watts per kilo. The fact that I'm heavier and taller, Zwift does take that into consideration and kind of puts me down as having a greater CDA, so more drag. So I will actually have to produce. It'd be harder for me. Well, for the same watts per kilo, I would actually be a bit slower than you guys, because I've got that bigger surface area. So that's, attention to detail. Just like in the real world, your
That's
surface
nice.
area and size of mass is taken into consideration.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah, great answer, guys.
Cool. Question 3 is from Len Prosser. And Len's saying, I have a relatively high FTP amongst my cycling friends. He's quoted 387 watts at 80 kilograms. But I find I can ride on the front of our group almost all day. However, I come to the climbs and even on the drags, I suffer badly. And this is even versus other riders with a lower 20-minute watts per kilogram. Any reason why this is so, and how do I best improve my climbing? Important note here, I don't feel like I can lose any weight. Now, the point you've made there, Len, is, you feel like you can ride on the front almost all day, but you struggle on the hills. And I think if your tendency is to ride on the front a lot, it's likely then that you do that, and likely then when you come to the hills, you're more fatigued than other riders. Now we've all know someone in a group ride who, you don't see them all day, on the front into the headwinds and the crosswinds, the hard slog in the first couple of hours, you don't see them. And then you come to maybe like the feature climb of the day, and all of a sudden they just appear having just put an energy gel in the back pocket, and they're fresh, and they fly up the climbs. Now that is, they may be physically a better climber, but it's also kind of, they've probably held themselves back a bit and saved themselves for that point in the ride. So I think part of it is not so much physically, it's kind of more tactically. So what I'm saying is perhaps next ride, don't get stuck in on the front, give yourself a bit of an easier ride, and then commit to that climb, and you'll probably see yourselves performing a little bit better. But also, you're quoting your 20 minutes power or watts per kilo is comparably better than other riders, but that's only really relevant on long climbs. If you're talking about climbs that are 3 minutes long, your watts per kilo over 20 minutes isn't that important. What's more important is your capacity or your ability to produce a lot of power for that shorter duration up those shorter climbs. So I think it's not as simple as I've got a better 20-minute, I've got a better threshold than this rider, so I should be able to climb all hills equally as well or better, full stop. It's different length hills require different physical attributes, so it's not quite as simple as that.
No, perfectly answered. I had exactly the same answers for that question. It was like, it can be also about how much fuel you've used. If it's slightly larger than everyone else, 80 kilograms to move that mass around, again, costs you more energy. If the hills come later in the ride, maybe you've used up way more energy than someone smaller that hasn't done as many turns. And then, of course, exactly what you said, your FTP doesn't really come into it. If it's a 5-minute, 3-minute climb, you just need capacity work. You need to do some VO2 work. You need to do some power work. It's your 20-minute climb power, your FTP, whatever. It doesn't really come into after 10 minutes going uphill, or it's at a high steady state. So it's I think if the climbs are shorter, work on your power, work on your O2, and try and hide a little bit more if you're one of those guys. And depending, again, when the climbs are, like if they're right at the end of the ride, the chances are you've burnt more calories than everybody else in the group. So maybe try and fuel better for the climbs, leading into the climbs, and maybe try and save some energy leading into the climbs.
Yeah, you guys have really answered that one well. There's not much more to add to that one. I guess my only thought while you were speaking then was that, and we talk about FTP quite a lot, but in reality, how often do we ride at our threshold for an hour? It's very rare.
Yeah.
Even time trials are generally shorter than that. So we need to really look at, as you touched on there, Matt, our power duration curve, and if it's a 4-minute climb, and Len there has said that he's at his ideal weight at the moment. So the only outcome is to produce more power over 4 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever that duration might be. So really focus on the type of climbs that you're riding on with your mates, and really try and increase your power for that duration that you're riding over.
We mentioned about kind of save yourself later in the ride, and if you are a type of rider who loves to ride on the front, if it's a headwind, you are going to be using exponentially more power, more energy versus someone sat in. You're plugging into, I'd say it's a strong headwind, and you're riding on the front, and you're producing 300 watts. chances are the guy sat in is going to be like almost freewheeling on the flat now. 80, 100 watts, no problem. Finding it so easy. So then obviously the apparent gap between those two riders just grows, and it's kind of exacerbated. Looks massive. When in reality, it's probably not that big. It's just the way that ride is panned out. Cool. All right, that wraps up podcast number 20 on sprinting. I think the next podcast is going to be on Zwift racing. So I think we've got Greg, Kev, we better do some Zwift racing. Try and get some good results in so we can bragging rights for the next podcast. Good to chat as always, guys. See you on the next one.
Looking forward to it, mate. Yeah, have a good week, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Greg.